Well, good morning, everybody. We're going to be discussing a very popular objection that you typically find amongst those who do not agree with our understanding of Sabbath keeping. And this is really not a popular objection. It is nonetheless an objection that exists, and so I think it's important for us to address it. Those who do not agree with Sabbath keeping don't typically say this, but those that do will say that Jesus, he actually broke the Sabbath and he didn't keep it. He violated the Sabbath pretty much. And so that's an important issue that we need to discuss in our efforts to be good apologists and to be able to give an answer when that moment comes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. And hopefully you're able to see this as we move along forward. So a couple of important details. For those of you who are members of the exclusive members of the Advent Defense League, this PowerPoint presentation is available to you. So you're able to, after presentation is done, it's going to be available under the files section. You can go ahead and download it, keep it, review it, and if you want to use it in your studies, in your Bible studies, in your presentations, in your sermons, by all means, please go ahead and do that. You are more than welcome. That is a privilege of yours for being a member of our training club. And for those who are not members, you're invited to join us in our training club. We do monthly presentations with speakers that we invite into our group to train us in apologetics, and then I give these weekly lessons as well. So the link will be in the description for those who will see this study afterwards. This is our study for today. This is called, or the lesson 1 is, did Jesus break the Sabbath? In John chapter 5, verse 13. Again, a very not much of a popular objection, but one that does exist and causes some confusion because of how this particular text reads. So let's go straight into it. Let me click here. All right, so here's the text. And it says, therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his father, making himself equal with God. This follows a healing that took place at a certain pool called the Pool of Bethesda that I did a little research on in archaeology, just random things online, and there's a little bit of a debate as to its location, its precise location, its origins, so on and so forth. So you're going to find a variety of things kind of explaining that particular location, that pool. But nonetheless, it did exist at some point in some location. And this miracle did take place according to the record. So this is the verse. What we're going to do is we're going to examine the verse in its particular context. And then we're going to then exit the context and go to the overall context, or to a bigger context, to other chapters in the same book and other texts to help us understand and explain this for us. I've outlined here six parts or 6 sections to this study. We're going to look at the critic's argument, what it is exactly that he says. And I'm doing that for a reason, because I have found that when I make when I provide a particular response to a particular argument, I have seen, it's been my experience, some critics will say, well, we don't make that argument, we don't say that. And so I'm only going to show this so we know exactly what it is that is said, with the disclaimer that not every critic makes this argument, okay? So we're going to start there. We're going to look at the just a brief overall context of chapter 5, where this verse is located. And then we're going to look at what kind of work Jesus did, or Jesus performed, okay? Because of verse 17, where Jesus says, my Father's always working and I too must work, right? The critics will say, those who agree with this will say, and Jesus was working on the Sabbath, and therefore he broke the Sabbath. right? Because the Sabbath forbids work. And so we're going to look at the kind of work that we did, and we're going to ask ourselves if Jesus, if the work that he performed was allowed to be done on the Sabbath. And then, let's see here. So then that's going to be section 3. Then we're going to look at section 4. Was it John or was it the Pharisees? I've noticed there's this debate between Adventists and non-Adventists in regards to that particular point. They say, some Adventists will say, well, it's not John speaking in that text. And then the reply is that it is John speaking in that text. So we're going to look at that, right? Let's examine that carefully and see what it says. Number 5, what does it mean when verse 18 says he broke the Sabbath? And that's where things are going to get a bit more explanatory. That's where we're going to go deeper, right? We're going to do a little bit of exegesis and look at the particular word there and examine what it means. There's a really strong parallel we're going to look at with point number 6 with chapter 5 and chapter 7. Chapter 7 is an explanatory, at least a section of it is an explanatory of what took place in chapter 5, and it's going to give us a lot of answers. So we need to really look at that parallel, and there's actually more parallels we're going to look at in section 6. Section 7 says, didn't Jesus cause the man to break the Sabbath by telling him to carry his mat? That's another point. Some people will say, well, he told the man to carry his mat, and in the book of Jeremiah, it was forbidden to carry burdens, which pretty much means just to carry a load, right? So since Jesus healed him, it was on the Sabbath, and told him, pick up your mat and walk. Well, therefore, according to our critics, Jesus broke the Sabbath by telling him to do that, or at least caused the man to break it. And then we'll conclude in section 8 with a brief conclusion of what we analyzed, what we looked at. So let's begin. The typical argument, this is section number 1, the critics' argument, right? So the typical argument is Jesus can break the Sabbath and still be blameless. But the critic must be careful to say, and be blameless, because the Bible says that sin is the breaking of God's law, right? And so the critics will say that, yes, Jesus broke the Sabbath, but that doesn't necessarily mean he sinned, when the Bible says that sin is breaking God's law. So let's look at that. Whosoever commits sin commits also lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. This is from the New King James translation. The King James says, sin is the transgression of the law. All right. I put that translation for 2 reasons. I like it. That's reason number 1. I think it's a good translation. And number 2, because when we use this particular text, our critics will say, well, that's a bad translation, and they'll go to the New King James. I don't particularly believe that the King James has a bad translation, but for the sake of this argument, we'll use this version. Without law, whether through ignorance or violation, this is what the original Greek means in the word anomia. So in the word anomia means lawlessness, right? But it's lawlessness in one of 2 ways, either by ignorance of it, not knowing it, so you're lawless, you don't have the law, or by a violation of it, right? And I think we need to, in order to determine that, we need to understand the particular context where the word is used. A lot of words are determined by context. In context of this particular verse, the command is to love, according to verse 11 and 23. Yet the Bible says that love is the fulfilling of God's law, right? And we can do a comparison with that between verses 12 and 16 to 17, but more specifically with what Paul said in Romans 13, where he specifically mentions the 10 commandments, right? He mentions a few of the 10 commandments, so we know which ones he's talking about. Then it says, in essence, love forbids violations of the Decalogue. So you can see that, for example, in chapter 2, verse 9, verse 16. Let me go ahead and read one of them just for sake of explanation here. So 1 John chapter 2. So the text we're looking at is chapter 3, verse 4. Chapter 2, verse 9, verse 16 tells us some information. So verse 9 says, he who says he is in the light and hates his brother is in darkness until now. And why did I put that verse? Because Jesus said, if you hate somebody without a cause, you have broken the command that says thou shalt not kill. So there's a real intimate connection between the spiritual aspect of the sixth commandment, now don't kill, and the literal aspect of it, of actually killing somebody, right? So in essence, what's being forbidden here is to not hate or not kill, which would essentially break the commandment, thou shalt not kill. So we see within the context of verse 4 of chapter 3, violations or the forbidding of violating aspects of the law, right? Look at verse 16. Verse 16 says, for the love of the Father is not in, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. The implication, of course, there is that we should avoid lusting of the world. You know, we should avoid pride. The Bible tells us in the book of Psalms that the commandment is exceedingly broad. So every sin that exists in one way or the other, whether I can explain it or not, in one way or the other breaks one or more of God's 10 commandments, right? Because his commandments are broad. They're not just what we read in numerically 10, there's more. So anyhow, when you read the particular context here in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, the emphasis is love, but love leads you to not hate your brother, right? To not kill. It leads you to not commit sin, right? It leads you to speak the truth. So love is the fulfilling of the law, quite literally. When you love, you don't kill, you don't steal, you don't lie, you don't lust, so on and so forth. And then Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, outlines some of the commandments, particularly the ones pertaining to our relationship with mankind, because that's the context in Romans chapter 13. And then he concludes by saying, if there be any other commandment, because they didn't describe them all, if there be any other commandment, they are briefly comprehended according to the King James. The New King James says they are summed up as this: thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So love is the fulfilling of the law. So when it says lawlessness, in context, we're talking about we're talking about keeping the law of love, which will in essence cause us to be obedient to God's commandments. And then we can further confirm that the connection between law and God's commandments when we read Romans chapter 7, where Paul says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. I had not known sin, but by the law. Or I had not known lust, except the law said, thou shalt not covet. And that's one of the 10 commandments. That's the 10th one, right? So going back to the particular argument, to say that Jesus broke the Sabbath, right, is dangerous, because, well, Jesus did not sin. Jesus kept the Sabbath, kept all of the commandments perfectly, right? Of course, some critics reply saying, well, yeah, Jesus kept the Sabbath and kept other commandments, but kept, Passover and stuff like that, which is true. But then again, that argument by itself admits that Jesus kept the Sabbath. So it self-destructs if you're going to say that Jesus broke the Sabbath, right? So that's the critic's argument. That's what he says. Let's go a little deeper now. Let's go to chapter 5. This is just a brief outline of chapter 5. So from between verses 1 through 15, you have the discussion with a crippled man by a pool in Jerusalem. We have his healing that takes place. It's a physical and a spiritual healing that takes place, because he later tells him when he sees him again, go and sin no more. The Jews become, of course, very angry because his healing took place on the Sabbath, and particularly because Jesus told him to pick up his mat on the Sabbath. Jesus finds the healed man later and tells him to sin no more. And so then a debate takes place between Jesus and the Pharisees for the rest of the chapter. So while it's important for us to read the whole chapter, for sake of time, we're focusing between verses 1 and verses 23, particularly 17 and 18 in this chapter. All right, that's a brief, just kind of a bullet point outline of chapter 5. Now, what was the kind of work that did? All right, Jesus said, and therefore did the Jews seek to persecute him, or to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Jesus answered, said, my Father always works and I work. All right. Some translation says, my Father has worked from the beginning and I too must work. Depends on the translation you're looking for, but essentially it's the same thing. All right. What was the work that Jesus did? Well, from this text, Jesus healed the man. Now, sometimes our critics are confused in regards to this. They say, well, healing was forbidden on the Sabbath. And essentially, they're making the same argument that the Jews did. When Jesus healed the woman who had an infirmity for 18 years, one of the Pharisees pretty much said the same thing. He said, there's 6 days in the week, go and get healed at that point, not on the Sabbath. So the critic aligns himself with the Pharisees in making that argument, right? The truth of the matter is that there was nothing wrong with healing somebody on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath essentially is an institution that was meant to bless mankind. And what better way to bless a man or a woman than by healing, right? And there's some examples of this. So ultimately, Jesus is the biggest example that we have by his actual fact of healing on the Sabbath. But we have some other examples. So right there in the very beginning, in Genesis chapter 2, when God rested on the seventh day, he simultaneously continued to uphold life on that day, right? So even though he was resting from his physical labor on the Sabbath of creating the world, yet a spiritual labor continued, which was upholding all things by the word of his power, according to these texts, Hebrews 1:3 and Colossians 1:17. And this is what's happening in chapter 5 with Jesus. You see, he's not doing secular labor, which is essentially what the fourth commandment forbids. It doesn't forbid spiritual labor, it forbids secular work, right? I don't know if secular is the right terminology, but I think you understand what I mean. It forbids that kind of work, mowing your lawn, going to your clinic if you're a doctor, or well, I would say more if you're a warehouse worker, whatever, right? But we understand that if you're a physician and you're helping people on the Sabbath, that is not necessarily violating the Sabbath, because Jesus, the great physician, healed on the Sabbath and helped people on the Sabbath as well, right? So God did a good work on the Sabbath in the very first one. So from the very beginning, he already set it the example for mankind that on the seventh day, spiritual work was original to the Sabbath and allowed. God stopped creating, but did not stop maintaining the lives that he created, right? Which was an important work. So Jesus is following the Father's example of blessing the creation. It's just that Jesus did it in this manner after sin. Jesus, when the Father did it in that manner before sin, and essentially continues doing it. There's some other examples. So in Isaiah 58, you find a connection in the same chapter between true fasting, service towards mankind, and then Sabbath keeping towards the latter portion of that chapter. The commandment itself offers rest even for the stranger within thy gates, right? Exodus 37 talks about the priest who tended the altar of incense, and the table of showbread. The bread was to be set in order every Sabbath. In 2 Kings 4:23, we learn that the prophets performed their prophetic work on the Sabbath. Again, this is spiritual work, right? This is work that was allowed on the Sabbath. It's not a secular work, right? We're not building a house on the Sabbath. We're not, again, mowing our lawn on the Sabbath. We're not clocking in at the local, restaurant that we work at on the Sabbath. No, this is spiritual work that was allowed. So the work that Jesus did on that day of healing a man was allowed for him to do. He was in essence doing what the Sabbath encouraged to get done. Some more examples. It says here in 2 Kings 11:5-9 that there were Israelite soldiers were in the service of God when they attended to their duties on the Sabbath. Ezekiel 46 talks about the gateway of the inner court facing the east that needed to be opened on the Sabbath as well. In Numbers 13:22, the Levites were to guard the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath. And it kind of implied in Joshua chapter 6, you don't really have it directly mentioned, the Sabbath, but it does say that God gave them a command to encircle Jericho for 7 days, which would essentially include the seventh day Sabbath as well. Right, and they did that during a military operation. This was a work that God commanded them to do, which was a holy work. So that which is holy, that which is essential for man's benefit, at that point, it was essential for the benefit of the Israelites, right? Because they were to conquer. That which is holy, that which is spiritual, that which is for healing, so on and so forth. These are not only are they allowed on the Sabbath, they are an integral part of the Sabbath. They are intimately connected to what Sabbath keeping is all about. Sabbath keeping is all about blessing mankind. Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, Mark 2:27. And so, so the work that Jesus did was not in violation of the Sabbath. And so in conclusion, and I use the verse there to conclude, I think it's absolutely clear. It says it is lawful to do good. Some translations say well, but nonetheless, same thing. It is lawful, meaning it is allowed, lawfully allowed, or legal. It is illegal, it is legally allowed to do good things on the Sabbath, according to Matthew chapter 12, verse 12. So Jesus did not violate the Sabbath in the act of working towards healing a man. When we see the word work there in verse 17, again, words need to be understood in their context. When it says not to work in the fourth commandment, in that particular context of that commandment, it's talking about resting without doing secular work, not talking about spiritual work, right? Or work that benefits mankind, holy work. Same thing here. When it says work, what's the context? Well, in the context, the work was healing a man, right? And that in essence was in keeping with the seventh-day Sabbath. Section 4, was it John or was it the Pharisees speaking in verse 18? Now, my understanding of this question, perhaps many of my Adventist brethren, or some at least, may not agree, but my understanding is that it was John speaking, right? In this verse. Of course, we still have to understand what he meant by the word broken, or broke the Sabbath. But before we even get there, yeah, it was John speaking in verse 18. But you know what? It was also John speaking between verses 2 and 4, where he mentioned that an angel came down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Now, we typically understand that that was some sort of legend or a legendary myth of some sort that existed at that time that John was just relaying. But it's just interesting how he says it as if it almost comes off as if he believed it, right? Even though we know that that's not the case, but it almost comes off that way because sure, he the same way he said that in verse 18, he said this about that pool and an angel coming down, stirring the water for healing, some sort of magical thing between verses 2 and 4. So I'm okay with it saying that John spoke it as much as I'm okay with saying that John spoke it between verses 2 and 4 in regards to the pool of Bethesda, right? So that doesn't really hurt the Sabbatarian approach, actually. So Jesus' subsequent miracle, however, at the pool bypasses all superstition, right? And it proves that the pool had no magical powers. So it's not as if John said it because he believed it. He said it because there was the belief of that time. Nonetheless, there was something true about verse 18, though, which we will need to look at. Verse 18 says that it says not only had he broken the Sabbath, right? We have to examine that word broken. The Greek word is G3089. So these numbers, these Strong's numbers help us to locate that particular word. So if you're going to do the research on it, that's the best way to find it. That's the word luo in the Greek. Now, when you look up the definition, and I put a screenshot here from a website called blueletterbible.com. And I put there the entire outline, of the usage of that word. So evidently, when you look at this, it depends on context. This word is not a word that just has one meaning, right? The word luo, translated broken, it depends on context. So, for example, to loosen off of something, right? So to loose any person or thing tied or fastened, like bandages from off the feet, so or the shoes. So you take off the bandages from off the shoe, you are loosening it off or removing it. The shoe is still there, the foot is still there, but you're removing this, right? A husband and a wife joined together by the bond of matrimony. They are being loosened from the bond of matrimony, right? From the bond of matrimony. Of a single man, whether he has already had a wife or has not yet been married, right? Loosened from that. To loose one bound, or as in to unbind, to release from binds, to set free. So of one bound up, swathed in bandages, right? So the idea we're getting is to remove from off of something. And I put this verse here as an example that I think may help. This is Luke 19:33. It says, and as they were loosing, which is the same word luo, translated broken in 5:18, John 5:18. As they were loosing the colt, the owners thereof said to them, why loose ye the colt? This is when Jesus sent them to go get the donkey, right? What's happening? The colt is being loosened or removed, right? So that they can take the donkey. So it's being removed from the stall, whatever it's being held on to. So you have a separation taking place. This is the idea that we're getting from this word, all right? However, the word can also mean or be used in the sense of to fail to keep a commandment. So you got Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. It says, whosoever therefore shall break, same word luo in the Greek, one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever shall do them and teach them shall be called great. So it can be used that way as well. So we have to ask our questions. The question is, which one of these did Jesus commit? Right? Did he violate the Sabbath? In the sense, did he break it in the sense of violating the Sabbath, as we find in certain texts like 5:19? Or was Jesus using it in the sense of loosening the Sabbath from off of something that was making it, legalistic, making it something undesirable, right? Is he loosening it from legalistic regulations that were imposed upon it, which typically we know, that the Pharisees had imposed upon the Sabbath at that time? For example, the Pharisees had told, I'm going to look at this text later, had told the woman who was healed after 18 years of infirmity, go get healed during one of the 6 days, not on the Sabbath. This is one of the popular beliefs of the Pharisees at that time. Was Jesus loosening the Sabbath from those legalistic ordinances, right? Legalistic, strict rules that the Pharisees had placed upon it, that burden that the Pharisees placed upon it? Or is he violating the Sabbath? Let's look at that. So this parallel, I think, answers that question. And it answers the question by saying pretty much that it's not that Jesus was breaking the Sabbath in the sense of violating it as a commandment, but more so that he was loosening the Sabbath from those legalistic rules that were placed upon it. All right. I've made this parallel in a way so that you can see that there's a connection between chapter 5 and chapter 7. And I tried to do a color connections here. So you can see where it says in chapter 5 that they tried to kill him, right? You can see the same thing in chapter 7. You can see in chapter 5, the man was made whole, the same day was the Sabbath. I underlined that portion. And then I underlined the same thing in chapter 7, that he made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day. Then we know this happened on the Sabbath. And in both chapters, we see that something was broken, right? So you have this strong parallel because chapter 7 is an explanation of what happened in chapter 5, or at least a defense by Jesus of the accusation that was leveled against him in chapter 5, right? His reference to when they tried to kill him in John 5:16, and also to the complete healing of a man, shows he is referring back to the healing he did in chapter 5. So there's references that he made in chapter 7 in that discussion with the Jews at that time and the leaders, tells us that he's referring back to chapter 5. So therefore, we're going to get more information about what happened in chapter 5 when we study chapter 7. So let's do that. 7 says, if a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken. It's Jesus talking now. Are you angry at me Some translation says, why are you angry at me? Because I made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day. So there was nothing wrong with healing a man on the Sabbath. We looked at that. But in other words, if they were not guilty, notice, if they were not guilty of working on a part of a man on the Sabbath through circumcision, then Jesus was especially not guilty in working the whole of a man on the Sabbath by healing him completely. That makes sense? So in other words, in chapter 7, Jesus is referring back to what took place in chapter 5. It tells them, why are you guys trying to kill me? You know, you guys do the same thing I did, except you're working a part of a man. You're doing the spiritual work, but you're doing it on a part of a man. I did it on the whole of a man. So why are you angry with me? You have no reason to be angry with me, right? In other words, Jesus, in essence, denied violating the Sabbath, right? And I like this commentary here from the Andrew Study Bible. It says, referring back to the charge of Sabbath breaking, chapter 5, verse 18, Jesus here denies he broke the Sabbath. In healing the paralytic, he was obeying the higher principles of the Sabbath. Circumcision was surgery on a body part, but Jesus was concerned with the whole of a man, right? So in essence, Jesus refers back to chapter 5, vindicates himself in the same way that they were doing a good work, which was circumcision, which was necessary for that to be done at that time. It hadn't ended yet. That's later at the cross. But since they were doing that work on the Sabbath day and they were guiltless, Jesus is also guiltless in what he did on the Sabbath as well. Does that make sense? So Jesus pretty much denies any violation of the Sabbath. Go deeper with this. There's a neat parallel with chapter 5, verse 18, chapter 5 and chapter 7, verses 22 to 23. There's a typo there, partner. It says, therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him because he not only broke the Sabbath, but then when you go to chapter 7, you see the parallel. If a man on the Sabbath day received circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry at me because I had made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath? So the breaking of the Sabbath that took place in John 18 was the healing of a man, right? So what Jesus did in breaking the Sabbath, which means loosening the Sabbath, was in essence healing of a man on that day. The breaking of or loosening of the Sabbath meant he was healing a man on the Sabbath, refuting the popular idea among the Pharisees that healing was forbidden on the Sabbath. And since it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And that popular idea is found in Luke 13:14, where after healing the woman of 18 years being under this infirmity, one of the Pharisees says, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them, therefore, come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. So what is Jesus doing then? Jesus is loosening the Sabbath from these legalistic strict rules that were placed upon the Sabbath and created a burden for Sabbath keeping. So Sabbath keeping was no longer desirable, it wasn't enjoyable, it wasn't beneficial, at least physically. It was a burden. And so Jesus came to vindicate it. This is why it says in the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah, it says, he shall magnify the law and make it honorable. What we're seeing in Jesus's treatment of the Sabbath is not a violation of the Sabbath, but more of him making it honorable, magnifying it and making it honorable. In contrast to the Jews, or at least the Pharisaic Jews, who did not make it honorable, but rather made it a burden. So when it says that Jesus had broken the Sabbath, what it means, according to the explanation we receive in chapter 7, and a deep understanding of the word luo, Jesus had loosened the Sabbath. There are other words John could have used that literally mean violating the Sabbath, which we're going to look at in a moment. But before then, there's an explanatory parallel here that I thought was interesting. Now, I mentioned the story a few times already, but this is a story of another healing that took place on the Sabbath, of a woman who was healed after 18 years of having an infirmity. What I find interesting is that we find there the word luo again in verse 16, but then we find another Greek word in verse 12. So let's read verse 12. It says, but when he saw her, he called her to him and said to her, woman, you are loosed from your infirmity. Now, that particular Greek word, loosed, notice what it means according to the outline usage or to the definitions. It means to set free, to let go, to dismiss. Now, when Jesus comes back, he has this argument with the Pharisees. He mentions what he said in verse 12 again, but uses a different word. What word does he use? He uses luo, the one that's used in John 5:18, right? In other words, there's this parallel between these two Greek words. And when you look at the former Greek word, right, in verse 12, we have their confirmation, or at least more information about how Jesus intended on using that particular word, luo, which was to mean to loosen, to set free from, right? To set free from or to loosen, not so much to violate or to break. Here's some words John could have used in this situation, but didn't. He didn't use anomia, right, which means a condition of being, whether without the law, whether in ignorance of it, or of breaking it or violating it, right? Neither did John use the word Parabetos, right, which is a word that literally means a transgressor or a lawbreaker. Now, John could have used that word if that's what Jesus did. Jesus violated the Sabbath. He could have used these words right here, but he didn't. Instead, he used a word that depends on context, and we looked at that, right? So this particular word, especially in James 2:11, is very interesting because it's actually used in the context of the 10 Commandments, of which the Sabbath is a part of. It says in verse 11, "For he that said, 'Do not commit adultery,' said also, 'Do not kill.'" We know that that's from the 10 Commandments, right? Now, if you don't commit adultery, but you kill, you become a transgressor of the law, right? In essence, break one, break them all, according to verse 10 and 11 in James chapter 2. So this is not the word that's used there, though, because it's very simple, right? The reason is very simple, because Jesus did not break it in the sense of transgressing the Sabbath. He broke it in the sense of loosening the Sabbath. He broke off the Sabbath from those legalistic rules that were placed upon it, those burdens that were placed upon it. And then we have, and we're drawing to a close here, but then we have section 7, and this is important for us to address. Didn't Jesus cause the man to break the Sabbath by telling him to carry a mat, right? Why am I bringing this up? Because many of our critics will bring up Jeremiah chapter 17 that talks about how carrying a burden, which pretty much means a load, on the Sabbath was forbidden. So therefore, when Jesus told the man to carry the load or the burden on the Sabbath, then therefore Jesus violated the Sabbath commandment, right? Or at least told the man to violate the Sabbath commandment. But I think the critics have not really examined carefully Jeremiah chapter 17, and I want to just do that briefly. When you look at Jeremiah 17, it says that on the Sabbath day, you should not carry a burden. So verse 21 says, "Thus saith the Lord, take heed yourselves and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem, nor carry a burden or a load out of your houses on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but hallow the Sabbath day." So one of the reasons why the kingdom of Judah was attacked by Babylon, one of them, not all of them, but one of them was because of their constant violations of the Sabbath, right? And so the warning here is to cease from doing that. Now, it's very important for us not just to look at the immediate context, right, of a particular verse or verses, but to also expand our understanding, our desire to understand, to include the whole Bible by every word of God, right? All scripture is given by inspiration of God. When you do that, you realize that there's an explanatory chapter in Nehemiah chapter 13, which gives us more explanation of what's being spoken about in Jeremiah 17. How do I know that? Well, first of all, you can see by the colors that there is another parallel here, right? Burdens and burdens, the gates, the Sabbath. There's a strong parallel here. Jerusalem, Judea. So it's talking about the same thing, but it directly refers to it when you read verse 18. Verse 18 says, and this is after the fact, after they had started, years after, 70 years after they had already been in bondage, and maybe not so much bondage, but in Babylon, Nehemiah finds individuals conducting business transactions on the Sabbath. And notice how Jeremiah refers back to their Sabbath breaking, of which Jeremiah 17 is talking about. Notice what he says, verse 18, did not your fathers do thus? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? He's referring back to the Sabbath breaking that took place previously, which we find in Jeremiah 17. But Nehemiah now adds information that Jeremiah 17 does not have. And what is that information? That the burdens that they were carrying in Jeremiah 17 to break the Sabbath was not you carrying a simple mat or carrying the scrolls with you. That makes no sense. You know, we have to carry things. They had to carry things. How did they carry the scrolls from one part of the other to another to then read them wherever they're reading them, on the corners and synagogues, wherever, right? They needed to carry things. But the particular problem was not so much carrying random things, but it was carrying things for the purpose of conducting business on the Sabbath, which then violates the Sabbath, right? How do we know that? Well, we could read it right there in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 15. It says, in those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with the wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens or loads, which they brought into the Sabbath on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. You see that? Verse 16, men of Tyre dwell there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods, and the word is sold them on the Sabbath day. So we see that it's the carrying of burdens that Jeremiah 17 is warning about. It's not just carrying anything, but it's carrying for the business of conducting business transactions. Right? So I'll just read the comment here that I put. Note that the problem was not merely carrying burdens or loads, but carrying burdens to do business, to sell, to buy, things like that. So therefore, what took place in John chapter 5 when Jesus told the man to carry his mat, the Jews themselves they got angry about that, likely thinking of Jeremiah 17, right? Even though for sure they probably carried stuff on the Sabbath, but nonetheless, likely they were thinking of that particular prohibition. But they misinterpreted it, you see. And so what our critics do when they use the same argument is they, once again, are aligning themselves with the misinterpretations of the Pharisees, right? And not with Christ, unfortunately. So they are aligning themselves with them and interpreting it in the same manner. But biblically speaking, the burdens that they were carrying had to do with business transaction, and that's not what the man was doing when he was carrying his mat on the Sabbath in John chapter 5. Neither is what Jesus told him to do. In conclusion, we have here, in context, Jesus had healed the man on the Sabbath, but acts of mercy and service to God was always permissible and even encouraged on the Sabbath. When John says that Jesus broke the Sabbath, he uses a term that signifies loosening the Sabbath. This healing or loosening on the Sabbath from he was healing or loosening the Sabbath from the strict legalism of the Pharisees, which said healing was forbidden on the Sabbath. John's recording of Jesus's defense in chapter 7 confirms that Jesus did not violate the Sabbath did not break the Sabbath in the sense of violating the Sabbath, but he broke it in the sense of releasing it or breaking it off of those legalistic rules and regulations. This is what took place in John chapter 5. Jesus did not break the Sabbath in the sense of violating it because he was perfect and he kept the commandments completely. So I hope this helps. I hope this was a blessing to you. And if there are any questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments. But God bless you. We're going to be doing these lessons weekly. So watch out for next week as we find another argument of the critics and examine them together. God bless you guys. Take care. We'll do this again.